Okay. First, I want to thank my colleagues, Senators Murray, Cardin, Durbin, for being here today. Now, first, we grieve for the people of Boulder, especially the families of the lost ones. When you think somebody kissed someone goodbye on the way to work, someone sent someone off to school, and they didn't even know it, and they'd never see them again. It's a horrible, horrible thought, and worse, of course, so bad for them. We also think of brave police officer Eric Talley, who died. So, to honor the victims of this horrific shooting, the flags at the U.S. Capitol are being lowered to half-staff today. It's just another awful tragedy. It's less than a week after 8 people were killed in a series of shootings in Georgia. And it's a sad reminder, COVID is not the only epidemic in our country. We have to confront the devastating, unrelenting epidemic of gun violence that steals thousands of innocent lives across this country. And so we have a lot of work to do. I've already committed to bringing universal background checks legislation to the floor of the Senate. The Senate Judiciary Committee, under Chairman Durbin, held a hearing to examine several common sense proposals to reduce gun violence this morning. But make no mistake, the Senate legislative graveyard is over. 2 summers ago, after another horrific shooting, the Republican leader, then Majority Leader McConnell, promised that there'd be a debate in the Senate floor on gun violence. It never happened. Republicans seem averse to even wanting to talk about the epidemic of gun violence. Like the start of the COVID epidemic, their strategy is to downplay and hope the problem goes away. This Democratic-led Senate will be different. The Senate is not going to hide. We're going to debate and address the epidemics of gun violence in this country. The last month has shown out how exactly different the Senate is. We've confirmed now all of Biden's cabinet secretaries. We've held an impeachment trial, and we passed one of the most significant pieces of legislation to pass in decades that will help and will bring relief to Americans. And the Senate has another important piece of legislative business on the agenda this week, and that's the extension of the bipartisan Paycheck Protection Program, which is set to expire on March 31st. Our Small Business Committee Chairman, Senator Cardin, is here to talk about the importance of extending PPP and all of his work to get this done quickly. There's no reason to let this program expire while there are scores of small businesses still in line and billions of dollars left in the program to provide desperately needed help. The House passed the extension 415-3, only 3 negative votes. We hope the Senate will move the bill quickly, that no one will stand in the way, that no one will block it. The Senate must pass another extension of the PPP program, Paycheck Protection Program, before the end of the week to make sure that the nation's small businesses can access this vital lifeline as we all begin to recover from the crisis. But let me be clear, we are not going to end this week without passing an extension. And I'm confident that once again, we will get the job done. Senator Durbin.
Thanks, Senator Schumer. Last week, 1 week ago today, I announced that I'd be holding today's Judiciary Committee hearing on gun violence. The same day, before the sun set, there was a horrific string of shootings in Atlanta, Georgia, that took the lives of 8 victims. Last night, as I was preparing for today's hearings, there was another unspeakable mass shooting, this time at a grocery store in Boulder, Colorado. 10 people killed yesterday, including Boulder police officer Eric Talley, 51 years old, father of 7. It's a devastating loss. These victims and their loved ones are worthy not only of our thoughts, they're worthy of our prayers, and they're worthy of our actions. Enough thoughts and prayers. Now let's do something. This morning, one of the Republican senators, the junior senator from Texas, came in and called the hearing ridiculous theater. Well, I don't believe there's any part of it that was ridiculous. It was dead serious. As we consider these victims and so many more, 40,000 each year who die across America. Theater? theater is a departure from reality. We're in reality, and it's called the Judiciary Committee in the United States Senate and the Congress of the United States, with the authority, and I hope the opportunity, to use that authority to make America safer. I thank Senator Schumer for what he said about bringing this bill to the floor. I hope that we can complement whatever your effort might be in the committee. I don't know if we'll get a bipartisan vote, but I want to make it clear through this hearing today, the door is open for conversation. But universal background checks are not only supported by 90% of Americans, but a majority of gun owners. They trust that if we have a law and people follow it, we'll be safer as a result of it. It's only the gun lobby and some people on the other side of the aisle who don't see it that way. We owe it to the families across America to make this country a little safer. And what we learned both in Atlanta and Boulder, Colorado, is that there's a lot of work to be done, and innocent people will continue to die until we do it.
Senator Murray.
My heart goes out to the families who are mourning in Boulder today, including the family of Officer Eric Talley, according to reports, the first officer who arrived to respond. To those reeling after 8 lives were lost in Georgia 1 week ago, including 6 Asian American women, and to every worker, parent, student, and every person in our country who lives each day with the preventable, unacceptable, and deadly threat of gun violence in their workplace, at school, or when they're out in their community, or even when they're home. In our state, my state, families will never be the same after Marysville, after Mukilteo, after the Seattle Jewish Federation, and so many others. According to the Giffords Law Center, there are 753 gun deaths in Washington state each year. That amounts to 1 every 12 hours. For years, Democrats have pushed for action to stop this killing with common sense reform that will save lives. For years, we've been blocked by Republican leaders and their special interests. Now, we can act, and we will. People across the country and across the political spectrum want these tragedies to end. They know no matter how you vote, the threat of gun violence is real.
I am of the day.
They want this to stop, and Democrats are committed to making sure that it does.
Ravenswood. Media keeps talking about CT's fast vaccine rollout, Connecticut's fast vaccine rollout. However, no one appears to be talking about how instead of starting high school high-risk and essential workers on March 1st, Lamont removed them from priority lists to only go by age groups. I have a systemic immune disorder with damage to my heart and lungs. My wife is an essential worker and cannot work from home. We felt completely helpless and vulnerable.
Oh my
Getting
God.
the military-style weapons off of
All
our
right,
streets,
folks.
private ownership
See you.
will save lives.
Oh.
And Senator Schumer said,
No,
we
Check
have
out my
not
show.
only a
Starts in 20
COVID
minutes. We have
pandemic,
Laurie
we have
Laybourn
a
Langton and Matthew Lawrence,
violence
co-author of
pandemic
Planet
in
on
this
Fire.
country.
So go check it out.
Thank our
20
leadership
minutes.
for bringing
Emma,
these issues
Nomi,
forward.
Matt, Brendan, good
I
job
just
today.
want to spend a
See you
moment
folks
on
tomorrow.
the bill that will be coming up later this week, and that is the extension of the Paycheck Protection Program. The House passed this legislation, as Senator Schumer pointed out, by 415-3 vote, strong bipartisan vote, that would extend the program from the end of this month, 2 months for applications and an additional month for processing those applications. This extension is desperately needed. Let me just give you an example. The Biden administration reached out to the more difficult small businesses to get help. The smaller small businesses had an exclusive opportunity for 14 days. As a result of that opportunity for those companies, 20 employees or less, during that 14-day period, 400,000 signed up for the forgivable PPP loans. But here's the point. Almost 200,000 were first-time PPP recipients. They needed help in reaching out. We have changed the eligibility in the American Rescue Plan. The Biden administration has made it more available for those who do not have employees, the self-employed. This requires time to get these applications not only filed, but processed. As a result, if we do not extend the program, there are going to be a lot of small businesses that are going to be left out. We know that. That's why there's bipartisan legislation to extend the date. Senator Collins has filed the bill in the Senate, along with Senator Shaheen and myself. It's bipartisan. We've always worked together on these issues. We need to get it done. Now, here's the important point. We'll have a hearing on this tomorrow. We'll get the exact numbers, but we're estimating that at the end of March, there's going to be about $50 billion still remaining in the PPP allocated funds. So the funds are there, but we need to extend the law in order for this to work. I know some of my colleagues say, well, can't we change things around here and there? Our committee is open anytime to look at changes in the PPP program. The first order of business is to make sure the program is still there. And that requires the passage of this bill unamended by the end of this week. And I thank Senator Schumer for giving us the opportunity to extend the PPP program.
Thank you. Go ahead, Jim.
Thanks. I've been in this room many times. The day after a mass shooting, each time Democrats have said, this is going to be the time. Gabby Giffords, Steve Scalise, Sandy Hook. But none of these mass shootings have happened in an environment when there is a serious conversation about turning off the filibuster. Why would this not be the occasion if you really want to get gun control done?
I am going to meet with Senator Murphy and other Democrats this week that have been set up already, and we will figure out the best path forward. Next.
Senator Manchin said that he doesn't support the gun legislation that came out of the House. I'm curious what your reaction is to that, but also would Democrats and would you be supportive of a more tailored bill like Manchin?
As I said, I'm going to sit down with Murphy and others, and we're going to figure out the best path forward, but we will put these bills on the floor. I have said that, and it will happen. Yes.
Have you spoken to the White House about an assault weapons ban? President Biden has called for something like that.
I haven't.
Not
yet.
Later this week, the House will advance a bill that repeals the 1991 and 2002 authorizations for the use of military force in Iraq. What is your view of how the Senate should address that issue?
Yeah, it's something that I would be sympathetic to. I think a large number of our caucus would be sympathetic to it, and we're going to discuss the way to go forward on that as well. Yes?
Senator Feinstein today asked for a hearing on her assault weapons ban bill. I wondered if you're going to have one in your committee.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear her request. No, I know what she's interested in, but she did. This is the first I've heard of it.
But this was in
I
her
stepped out of the
statement.
room.
She noted that she had 35 co-sponsors on the bill to renew the assault weapons ban. She said she'd like to have a hearing.
All right, I don't want to slow
on it.
down the efforts on the floor. Bringing this matter to the floor is the highest priority because that's where we have an opportunity to enact it, pass it. But I'm also hoping that we can do something consistently with that to make sure that the committee, Judiciary Committee, has a hearing and considers even specific amendments that get into these areas. I'm not ruling that out, but I think it's time, over time, that we go on the record for some of these common sense constitutional responses.
So you're not ruling out that an assault weapons ban might be part
I
of...
want to speak to Senator Feinstein, make sure I understand exactly what she's looking for, okay?
Can I follow up on that?
In the back.
Can you just give us a little bit of a preview of the next work session? You all are going to finish your work this week. Do you think that the gun issue will come forward in April?
Look, there's a whole lot of things that we want to do. We still have a lot of cabinet or sub-cabinet people to confirm. We have judges to confirm. We have a lot of bipartisan legislation that's being talked about and looking at, the China legislation, China government legislation, water legislation, things like that. And we have a lot of bills that came over from the House that we want to put on the floor and get votes on and hopefully pass them. So we have a whole lot of things that we're going to be doing in the next month. Yes? Yelling out doesn't get you to be called first.
Several Republican senators have
But I will call on you.
Several Republican senators have said today that they're supportive of expanding background checks to commercial gun sales. Are you planning or open to conversation?
As I said, we're having a discussion about the best way to move forward, but we will have the House bills put on the floor for a vote.
Today, Postmaster General DeJoy laid out his 10-year plan for the post office, which appears to include raising postal prices, slowing down mail service, as well as looking for pension reform and other efficiencies. Thoughts on, and anyone who wants to weigh in, thoughts on the changes to the post office?
Look, I've been disappointed in Mr. DeJoy since he came in. He doesn't seem to want to keep keep the post office as robust as 90% of America wants a post office kept strong. So I haven't seen his exact plan, but we're going to look at things, pension reform and things like that. The problem that the post office has, that they have to put aside money for health insurance long before any other private or public company does, is something we want to look at. But we believe in a robust post office. We do not like DeJoy cutting back.
What do you think about some reports that White House advisors are talking about breaking up the infrastructure package, moving a smaller, maybe bipartisan one first? Chris Coons has endorsed that idea. What's your reaction to that?
We're talking to the White House regularly. We had a lengthy discussion this weekend, and we're going to look. The one thing we're united on: Speaker Pelosi, President Biden, myself. We want a big, bold, strong package. As we've always said, we'd prefer to work with Republicans to attain that package. If we can't, we'll move forward other ways, but there are various different options that we're exploring.
Back on guns, in September 2019, after the Dayton, El Paso shootings, then Attorney General Barr was up here negotiating. And is that something that you pick up on and work off of as a template, or is it different now because you folks are in charge? And
well, as I said, it's different that we're in charge. We're not going to do what McConnell did and never let a vote occur, never let anything see the light of day. We have to figure out the best way to get the most done, and that's what we're going to figure out. Thank you. Last one.
One more. Just to follow up on guns again. So why are you prioritizing the expanded / universal background checks over an assault weapons ban?
I'm not going to pick which of them. The background checks bill passed the House. It passed it overwhelmingly. It's supported by 90% of Americans, 80% of gun owners. It's a very important thing to do. That is not to say we wouldn't look at other things as well. Thank you.
Do you think it has a better chance of passing and reaching the president's desk?
One question.
Just wanted to clarify.
Important thing to do. That is not to say
Chairman Peters, and thank you very much for your very gracious words. I appreciate that quite a bit. Mr. Chairman and Senator Lankford, and members of the committee, my colleague Nick Marinos and I are pleased to be here to discuss the 2020 census. As you noted, Mr. Chairman, in your opening comments, census data are used by government at all levels, the private sector, researchers, citizens, to provide a national 10-year roadmap for making decisions. So it's absolutely vital that we get it right, and as you mentioned, get the right count in the right place and only once. In being here today, Nick and I have the great privilege of presenting the work of our GAO colleagues who have been supporting congressional oversight of the census for many years. As the committee is well aware, even in the best of circumstances, completing the census is an enormous and complex undertaking. Yet, Mr. Chairman, as you and Senator Lankford noted, 2020 was by far from the best of circumstances, with the COVID-19 pandemic making the census all the more challenging. Just over 1 year ago, as the Bureau had begun to mail out invitations to participate in the census, it was forced to suspend field operations because of COVID-19. The Census Bureau subsequently delayed field operations multiple times and made a series of late changes to the design of the census. Our prepared statement details those changes the Bureau made in response to the pandemic and related executive branch decisions. Overall, the changes affected the way the Bureau did its work, and as well as the time it took to do the work. The changes also introduced risks of quality to the congressional apportionment and redistricting data. As you know, and as you've both mentioned, the Bureau's current plan is to deliver apportionment count data by April 30 and final redistricting data by September 30. As it prepares this data, I would underscore 2 points from our work. First, as Director Jarman noted,
The Bureau is responding to recommendations by the American Statistical Association and the Department of Commerce's Census Scientific Advisory Committee. We view these as very positive developments. These recommendations called for the Bureau to document what it knows in near real time about the quality of the population counts that it provides to the President and to the Congress. We also reported in December on census quality indicators that the Bureau should consider provided when it releases apportionment counts. These quality indicators were consistent with the work of the ASA and the Advisory Committee. We firmly believe and agree with the Census Bureau that disclosing what is known and not yet known about census data in near real time will increase transparency and public confidence in the census. Second, in December, we also identified concerns about how late changes to the census design could affect data quality. These concerns range from how the altered timeframes affected population counts during field data collection to what effects, if any, the compressed and streamlined processing of census data have on the Bureau's ability to detect and fully address processing or other areas. We recommended in December, and a report issued just yesterday, that the Bureau ensure that its 2020 assessments first address how the late changes to the census design could affect data quality, and second, support planning for the 2030 census. The Department of Commerce and the Census Bureau agreed with both of those recommendations and described ongoing and planned activities to implement them. Notably, the Bureau's activities included planning to release the information, as I mentioned, and findings on data qualities as it becomes available. One final point. As you know from the hearing that the Comptroller General held before this committee earlier this month, the decennial census remains on our high-risk list. Normally, it would come off in the year after the census is completed. However, he asked us to keep it on this time for two reasons. Not just because we're not done with the 2020 census, but for precisely, Senator Langford, as you were mentioning, we need to be thinking early and hard about what the 2030 census is going to be looking at. The Census Bureau made a number of important innovations and changes as it was preparing and planning for the 2020 census. We need to make sure that energy and momentum and that force of innovation carries through into 2030 as well. Let me end there, and once again, I want to thank the committee and you, Mr. Chairman, for your very kind words, for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I'll be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Mann. Our final witness today is Mr. Nick Marinos, Director of Information Technology and Cybersecurity at GAO. His team has led GAO's work to analyze the IT and cybersecurity components of the 2020 census, a crucial part of the operation, particularly as the census was the first, or this last census was the first to have online response option. His team also performs audits across all major federal agencies in the areas of cybersecurity, critical infrastructure, privacy, and data protection. Mr. Marinos joined GAO in 2002. Welcome, Mr. Marinos. You may proceed with your 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senator Langford, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting GAO to discuss the status of the 2020 census. So today I'd like to provide you with an update on IT systems, cybersecurity, and the Bureau's efforts for protecting the data it collected from census respondents. Starting with IT systems, as the chairman noted, the Internet Self-Response System operated as intended during the 2020 census, and most people who self-responded did so online. And the Bureau reported that it did not experience any system downtime during the census. In addition, the Bureau's use of smartphones to conduct non-response follow-up work played a critical role in its ability to adapt to the pandemic and achieve a higher than expected rate of worker productivity. Nonetheless, the Bureau still has important system implementation work to do. Currently, the Bureau is processing census responses, which is a critical activity intended to help ensure that the data are complete and formatted correctly. In addition, system testing is still ongoing for important census operations. Among these is the Bureau's post-enumeration survey, which is intended to assess the quality of the 2020 census. Going forward, a continued focus on meeting testing milestones and scheduled deployments will be important for ensuring that the Bureau's systems operate as intended. With respect to cybersecurity, as Dr. Jarman pointed out, the Bureau has reported no major cyber incidents that have impacted decennial operations. Throughout the past several years, the Bureau coordinated with officials at DHS's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, known as CISA, leveraging their expertise to conduct cybersecurity assessments and provide consultative support. The Bureau also implemented a trust and safety team to quickly respond to disinformation and misinformation events in order to protect the reputation of the Bureau and the integrity of the 2020 census. In light of recent high-profile cyber attacks impacting both public and private sectors, however, it's vital for the Bureau to continue its vigilance and to work with CISA to ensure that its remaining operations are adequately protected. Turning to the topic of data protection. Now that the data collection has ended for the 2020 census, the Bureau's focus is shifting to the development and release of statistical products. When producing and distributing these products, it's important for the Bureau to maintain the confidentiality of individual respondent information as required by law. To do this, the Bureau plans to apply a data protection technique known as differential privacy. In December, we noted that the operational delays that Chris mentioned created uncertainty in the plans and schedules for differential privacy. Last month, the Bureau updated and finalized its schedule for implementing differential privacy on the redistricting data. We discussed these plans in more detail in our written statement, but the bottom line is that the next few months will be critical to implementing data protection. We are actively monitoring the Bureau's efforts in this area, and we will keep you updated. In summary, key technology innovations like the Internet Self-Response System and the use of smartphones in the field provided the Bureau with the ability to better perform its mission during the pandemic, but there's more work to be done. Ultimately, the success of the decennial census depends on the Bureau's ability to adequately protect the data it collected from millions of Americans. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement.
Well, thank you. Dr. Jarman, as you and your counterparts have testified, the 2020 census certainly faced unprecedented challenges, including delaying in-person counting by about 3 months, adapting your operations to the pandemic, facing interference as a result of directives from the previous administration that led to large-scale schedule changes. And we know any kind of change in long-established plans creates more risk and more error. So my question to you is, given all of the challenges and changes, how did the Bureau decide in 2021 that it needed more time for processing the data? And why do Bureau experts believe this total amount of time was necessary?
Well, thank you, Chair. So I think first and foremost, our objective is to release complete and accurate information. And so that drives many of our operational decisions last year and drives our decisions right now about how we're processing the data. So when we looked at where we were in the schedule and what still needed to be done, I think that's what drives.
Hello and welcome to the Nomiki Show. I am Nomiki Konst.
The United States Senate, I hope some are listening, should immediately pass the 2 House-passed bills that close loopholes in the background check system. These are bills that receive votes of both Republicans and Democrats in the House. This is not and should not be a partisan issue. This is an American issue. It will save lives, American lives, and we have to act.
41 Americans have been shot in the past week in mass shootings. 41 Americans have been shot in the past week in mass shootings and killed. 7 mass shootings have happened in the last weeks. Shootings were separate and horrifying events. These were all different ones in Georgia, Stockton, California, Gresham, Oregon, Houston, Texas, Dallas, Texas, Philadelphia, and then in Boulder, Colorado last night at a grocery store. In Georgia, 6 women of Asian descent were slain, and we were appropriately horrified. Then last night in Boulder, 10 people were gunned down, ranging in the age from 20 to 65 years old. One was a police officer with 7 kids. It is hard to keep up with the carnage, but this is the norm in the United States of America. There is one thing that ties all of these events together, particularly the 2 worst in Georgia and Colorado. In both Georgia and Colorado, a young man walked into a gun shop and legally purchased a weapon. Let me rephrase that. A young white man walked into a gun shop and legally purchased a weapon, a handgun in Georgia. Reports of an assault-style rifle in Colorado. Then within hours in Georgia of that purchase and days in Colorado of that purchase, the young men took the weapon and used it to murder people, innocent people, helpless people, in a vengeance, in a hateful way, what should be designated as a hate crime. People they had never met, whose lives they thought they had some right to sacrifice. We keep having the same conversation. There is hate, there is anger, there is racism, there is misogyny, and there is mental illness. They are all parts of this toxic pattern of violence. And guess what? That all exists globally. They are each on their own wrongs we must denounce, but none of these would produce the ongoing death toll were it not for the United States' role with the NRA. Guns more easily available than in almost any other nation on this planet. Guns more lethal and more concealable than most other countries allow in regular sale. Guns being sold to people who, by their own descriptions of their families, suffer from instabilities that call for treating them, not arming them. We need to come down hard and fast on these crazy gun laws that leave loopholes for all of these sales. Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York, has done a great service helping push the NRA into bankruptcy. I don't know if you know that. They are weak right now, the NRA. And the people are strong. They had just passed something. They just fought off restrictions in Colorado. Colorado, where Lauren Boebert, Congresswoman, has a restaurant where she brags about bringing her guns in to protect her. Well, maybe that's because the gun laws are so weak. We don't need to repeal the Second Amendment to shut down most of the gun sales that produce these horrible tragedies. That's the funny thing. And this is a bipartisan effort to shut down these loopholes, to take on the NRA, to take on what they've been able to do in state legislatures. It doesn't require a far left movement. There are Republicans, there are actual NRA members who agree with these reforms. We have Laurie Laybourn Langton today. It's going to be a great show. We have Laurie Langton today and Matthew Lawrence, authors of Planet on Fire. It is a manifesto for the age of environmental breakdown. Then later, Piper and Simon are here for our panel. I can't tell you, I have debated gun reform for the last 10 years. I have been involved with advocacy organizations in New York in particular. We're on repeat. And we have a crisis in our democracy when an organization like the National Rifle Association, who's lockstep with gun manufacturers, and the fact that we've been so beholden after how many shootings, after elementary schools have been shot up, after the country has been in crisis over massive shooting, after Las Vegas, after South Carolina. How many times are we going to have this conversation? The one different thing about this moment is the NRA is weaker. So we have an opportunity now with the Democratic president who's called for these reforms, the Democratic Congress and a Senate, and I understand the filibuster, but we have an opportunity right now to really do something bold. These loopholes are ridiculous. They really are common sense gun legislation. You can still get your gun if you pass a certain threshold, and then we take it from there. But the fact that we haven't done anything of impact in the last 15 years, I don't know what we are as a country. We're frozen. All right, we'll be right back with our first guests, and then later on our panel. Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. All right, guys, we are in the midst of March for the book club, and our interview with Mackenzie Ward just went up. It's a great interview. I think we're going to do a little bit of a promo of it on the show, but she is the author of Capital is Dead. Is This Something Worse? It's such an easy read, and it's actually very entertaining. She's very poetic in how she writes. I'm just trying to see if there's one piece in here where I could give you a little, maybe not. I don't know where it is. anyways, it's poetic, it's funny, it's wonky. I definitely recommend you check out our book club. This is the featured book of the month for the March book club. Of course, there are different book club levels. There's 1 book a month, there's 2 books a month, and there's 4 books a month. We have a bunch of interviews going up this week. It's going to be exciting. I definitely recommend it. Great interview, great conversation, all about how capitalism is dead, or is it on its way out? And what is this new form of capitalism? I'm going to guess it's the space that Elon Musk thinks in at night. Like, he's like thinking, what comes after crypto? Like, what's going to be the capital on Mars? That's where they are. And they're just dragging us with them. And thank God for Bernie Sanders for calling him out and saying, maybe you should think about Earth a little bit more. Doesn't mean that he doesn't believe in NASA. I know all the leftists started, piling in on him. It's just that Elon Musk in particular should be thinking a little bit more about Earth. And, he's given up his possessions, but he has all this money that he has just scrapped from the government that he supposedly hates so much. All right, so go check out our book club. It is at patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. Super fun. We've got a lot of books out. We put the calendar up on Instagram. So go check it out over there too. You can see what's coming. All right. We have our first guests here. Do we not? All right. New book, Planet on Fire, a manifesto for the age of environmental breakdown. We have Laurie Laybourn Langton. She's a senior research fellow at the Institute for Public Policy Research and a visiting fellow at the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter. And Matthew Lawrence. He is the founder and director of Commonwealth, a UK-based think tank that designs ownership models for a democratic and sustainable economy. Previously, he was a senior research fellow also at IPPR. Thank you so much for joining us.
Lovely to be here.
It's pretty late over there, right?
Oh, never too late for you. Never too late for you.
Oh my goodness. Already warming me up. All right. So what is we start off the show from a U.S. perspective. We had another mass shooting. We had 7 this week, just the normal here. And I was talking about how for the last 10 years, we've been debating the same thing, like over and over and over again. Like, how bad does it have to get before we take action? And I feel the same way, I think many of us do, about climate change. And, what's interesting about your analysis, and I'd love to hear you explain, is that this is a book, Planet on Fire, Manifesto for the Age of Environmental Breakdown, which calls into question how the political status quo has no answer to how the consequences of the climate emergency are dealing with inequities in society. So I'll go to Matthew, I guess, first. It's always tough with 2 people. Matthew, what was the inspiration behind your book? Why now?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned the shooters, which I think would be good to come back to, because we actually have a mass shooting in the book as an example of some of the sort of eco-fascist tendencies that are bubbling up. And I know Laurie's got a very well-primed pitch on the sort of origins of this. But I think one of the key things for us was, as you mentioned in the intro, both of us work in sort of UK policy in and around sort of like left-wing or transformative politics in the UK. And at the same time as seeing sort of, indigenous communities in the US campaigning against, sort of oil infrastructures and the rising movement on the streets across the world for both, climate and racial justice, we were sort of then also going into meetings in Whitehall, or where sort of government policy making is done in the UK, or with sort of political parties, and the striking gap between the scale of the emergency, the nature of the interconnected emergency, and then sort of not just sort of what was being offered, but even that at the level of analysis of like the recognition of the systemic nature of the crisis was sort of woefully, there was just a really striking, quite dangerous gap. And so our sense there was, this is a chance to try and contribute to a whole range of people who are trying to do this, trying to move forwards the analysis, move forwards the agenda, move forwards the sort of political arguments. But it really was like the origin somewhere was rooted in that like gap between being there in sort of policy world, trying to sort of work out how we advance the transformative agenda, and yet sort of just a real sort of lack of awareness from mainstream institutions that we were trying to influence. I don't know, Laura, if that's a fair summary.
No, it is, and what we've seen subsequently, in the last couple of years, is this amazing upswell of campaigning that is really getting to the heart of this problem. Much of it going on in the US, which has been hugely inspiring over here, along with what we've been getting in Britain as well. But even as the mainstream conceives of this as an unprecedented problem, we still have this huge gap where it can properly understand why this is the case. We've got Emmanuel Macron speaking at UN summit saying, we need more, we need to be more ambitious. We need to have more courage. We have Bill Gates saying, education is at the heart of it. Those things are really important, but there's something deeper going on here. And this is what we want to communicate with the book. And if I may, can I give you a quick story that we cite at the beginning of the book that I think helps understand this? Easter Island, out in the Pacific, Rapa Nui to the indigenous population, has become this kind of way for a lot of people to understand the predicament we're in and what's causing it, right? You had an island isolated away from many other, any kind of human influence for hundreds of years until Europeans arrived, right? And the story goes, they found a civilization that had collapsed, that had created these amazing head and torso statues that exist on the island, but now a complete mess. And the mainstream story around this is that they unthinkingly destroyed their local environment, committed ecocide by exploiting the trees and cutting them down, and then there not being enough food and ultimately turning on each other and there being a civil war. And that feels like a microcosm for what's going on now. The sort of world is like a planet-sized Easter Island in that we are unthinkingly destroying the natural foundations upon which any of this can occur. Now, the problem is with that story, which is very compelling, and I don't know about you, Matt, but when I was younger, I read the books on this and thought, that's such a good way to understand how this is happening. Our psychology, our short-termism is pushing us to the brink. Gosh, this is so frustrating. But the problem is with the story is it's not true. It turns out, what actually happened was that the local population had pretty much managed to live quite well with the limited resources it had on the island and managed them sustainably, often through cultural norms. And then Europeans came and they brought with them smallpox and they brought with them slavery. And they weren't just bringing those things for a laugh. They were bringing them there because they were compelled by an increasingly globalized economic system that meant that they were going all over the world, including into the middle of the Pacific Ocean, to find cheap nature and to find cheap bodies to slave and pour into their process of accumulation that was then leading to profit making. And it's that story that the mainstream is missing. And the fact that the false story, the one that talks about selfishness and stupidity, is the dominant one and not that one, is itself a story of the failings we see at the moment.
So, my mind automatically goes to these green campaigns that were devised and funded by oil and gas industries in the late 70s and 80s to put the pressure on the individual. Recycle, do certain things in your life, to even Jimmy Carter, lower your heat, put on a sweater so we can lessen our dependence on oil. Not like you have any power over that. But this was very much putting it on the individual rather than whether it's the government, the government's role in it, and the government's role within the economic system. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, precisely, exactly. That this at the end of the day is to do with huge economic structures that have sway over our lives and therefore how we interact with the environment. Right? A load of consumers didn't come together after the Second World War and say, do you know what, we need a global aviation industry to jet us around the world because that's our consumer choice. Those things grew up because governments funded them, because there were large companies who wanted to make money from it. And the idea that we're going to undo all that history and decarbonize aviation by a few consumers working together to make different choices is both laughable and frankly suicidal.
Just to add, it's just important to add. So when we talk about the oil companies, fossil fuel companies, it wasn't just that they were trying to shift this narrative onto like an individualized sort of almost like apolitical response. It's also that they knew the scale of the crisis. So I think there's a document in the late 70s from Exxon which predicted literally almost to the sort of exact number the sort of concentration of carbon in the atmosphere this year, and they got it sort of completely spot on. So some of the best sort of climate science was taking place in the 60s, in the 70s, in major fossil fuel companies. And again, that goes back to Laurie's point, there is a sort of structural dynamic in fossil capital, but in capitalism as a whole, that drives this expulsive, propulsive logic of expansion, extraction, enclosure, rinse and repeat. And unless we can break that sort of circuit, then we can expand renewables, we can shift to sort of greener forms of consumption. But if you don't actually break the logic of that underlying mass of sort of fossil capital, then we're in real trouble. And that's where the sort of individualized approach isn't enough. We need a systemic response to systemic crisis, really.
It's interesting though, because on the other hand, you have some industries because the consumer has caught up in the U.S., for instance. You have oil and gas companies that are shifting to renewables. You have some companies, fracked gas is being powered off of windmills right now. So there are some industry shifts, but I'm not a proponent of this, but you're seeing a little bit of an industry shift because of the consumers, which is great for them to champion and campaign on. It's like, well, look at it, it's working. That's sort of how they're lobbying for this, at least in the States.
Yeah, and the first thing to say is that we need both the changes from individual behavior and changes from systems, right? And there will be an element of this in the current makeup of our societies where consumers do have to drive certain changes, and that's very important. And individual behavior, of course, matters. If you're going pouring chemicals in a river, that is absolutely not that. That's going to have a wide impact as well as your purchasing decisions. But the story of how certain sectors, certain companies are changing their behavior is partly on the sort of top of the iceberg, as it were, is partly about consumer decisions, but the whole mass underneath is as a result of government decisions and policies and directions that they're setting. And again, it hides away that narrative that is often pushed by those companies, hides away the deeper drivers, the government's role in pushing changes to markets that they are then responding to, right? And it wasn't, for example, just the shock of the pandemic and lower demand for oil that led to the crisis that we've seen in the oil industry over the last year or so. It was also a longer term process of changes that were being made by government policy that was beginning to shift energy markets across the world.
So is there, if there was this much research, what I really haven't been able to understand is if Exxon had this such precise research on carbon emissions, wouldn't they know the point of no return? That just sounds like basic human understanding, like having empathy, understanding like timelines. That's what I think really doesn't make sense to folks. Is it's so much in front of us. How much more data do lawmakers need? How much, and maybe they're not, they're not researched or well-versed in climate science enough. That's very much the case in the United States. But at least Exxon has a sense, right?
So I think there's two things there. There's a number of things there. I think the first is that we know, fairly comprehensively that data alone is not enough, and that politics resides in emotion, in framing, in language, in sort of the composition of economic and social interests. So we can't rely on the terrifying scale of the climate crisis that is already here for billions of people, but is going to sort of magnify and expand, and the environmental sort of breakdown that layers on top of the climate crisis. So I think there's that. I think the second thing that sort of makes the sort of political crisis of environmental breakdown, and I think what we really stress in the book is that the crisis is above all political, because we actually do have the technical means, the resources to rapidly decarbonize our economy. The real challenge is in mustering like the political strategy and sort of political power to disembed the fossil fuel giants, the sort of ways of life that currently sustain unsustainable behaviors. But I think the one of the sort of tensions there is that many of those who are suffering now and will suffer most are those least responsible for how we got here. So to the Exxons, or to the sort of American consumer, as you say, who maybe is beginning to shift, but nonetheless, for many of those people, even if environmental breakdown, global heating, increased sort of superstorms is really affecting and damaging their lives and livelihoods, nonetheless, it's nowhere near as bad as if you live in Mozambique, if you live in sort of the Niger Delta, et cetera, et cetera. And so there is that pushing out, and that's why the climate crisis is a racist crisis, because it sort of creates a hierarchy of interests, of material needs, of sort of pain almost. And the Exxon class, let's call them that, will be most likely to be able to shelter much more effectively. We saw that story last year during COVID, or maybe before. Time seems to have sort of welded together over the COVID crisis, but of all these sort of billionaires buying these bolt holes in New Zealand. And so you can kind of see in that, well, yes, they might say, well, yeah, sure, the world will look pretty bad with a 3.5 degrees rise or a 2 degree rise or indeed a 1.5 degree rise for lots of people. But we'll be able to buy ourselves out of it. We'll be able to shelter ourselves. We'll be able to create a bubble. And so I think there's lots of things going on there that we can't just rely on alone data and empathy, because that's clearly, if we've seen over the last 100 years, that's clearly not enough as a political strategy.
Well, I mean, even against their bottom line, that's what I don't understand is if you're, it's great that you're making profits right now, but in 10 years, you're going to be underwater and you're not going to be able to drill in Libya. You're not going to be able to drill in these places.
I mean, I think one thing, just to jump in again, and I think Andreas Malm's book, Fossil Capital, really goes into this very well. But I think one of the key interesting things here is that, fossil fuels are a stock. They literally sort of decompose energy under the ground, whether it's coal, oil, gas. Whereas renewable energy is a flow. It's sort of wind, it's, sunshine, et cetera, and that flow is much harder to control, enclose, and therefore make profits out of it. So actually, even if you've got a bit more flooding in, some of the examples you mentioned, or this, that, and the other, controlling the stock of fossil fuels will always be much more profitable, at least in the sort of short to medium term, which is the time horizon that many of these companies operate on, than trying to sort of control the flow of energy. And that's why you see, you see very sort of extensive fossil fuel lobby, but you don't really see a sort of nearly the equivalent scale of renewable sort of green lobbying in sort of Washington or wherever it might be. And I think it's that sort of the political economy of energy and how it relates to different interests, how it relates to different abilities to sort of make profit or not, I think is one of the key drivers there.
One's finite, one is not. So when you say you've got these economic systems that need to be addressed, what are some solutions? What can we envision as, taking on the politics is a big, as I mentioned with the NRA, been hitting our heads against the wall for decades now, since these mass shootings have blown up in this country. The democracy, at least in the United States, is decomposing at this point. So if it's just purely political, are there other options?
Yeah, I think so. We explore an array of areas in which we can make change over the course of the book. One area that we start off with is looking at what the mainstream strategy increasingly looks like it will be, right? So you could say that one of the big stories of this decade is, to put it crudely, neoliberalism is going to give this a go. And COP26, the big UN climate conference in the UK at the end of this year, could be ground zero for a kind of status quo triumphalism. Everyone slaps themselves on the back. Biden's been elected. This is great. America's back. China's signing up to a net zero target, and many other countries do at the same time. And that the strategy for trying to follow through on those targets, because of course targets don't meet themselves, you could crudely say is this: implementing policies that speed up the market's ability to swap dirty technology, whether they be cars or power plants or whatever, for clean alternatives. And I'm pretty sure that story will seem hugely compelling in the context of a COP that hopefully goes well, where many nations sign up to these net zero targets, the ones that the scientists tell us we need to be abiding to, and in which we start to continue to see this acceleration in energy markets, right? But that strategy could be, you could say it's the biggest bet in human history, because it's not questioning the consumption model at the heart of all of this. And to put it simply, do we have enough environmental room, whether that's carbon to burn, or biodiversity to destroy or make extinct, or soil to deplete? Do we have enough of that left to swap all of the dirty stuff for clean stuff, all of the stuff that exists right now, but then also the new stuff that we say we're going to make if we're going to offer a very particular Western American consumption model to everyone on the planet, right? And a lot of people are starting to question that, have questioned it for a long time from communities that have been on the front line of the failures of that model for centuries. And an alternative would be to, while also swapping dirty for clean, try and create a different model of consumption, a different purpose for the economy that starts to put the other things that we know we should be doing anyway to live better lives more at the forefront of then what our economy should be doing and creating, more public luxury, shared spaces, the time to spend with your relatives and your loved ones, less time at work or better quality work, all of the things, incidentally, that we've better appreciated by being in this pandemic situation, things that we really understand make life worthwhile.
And I think, definitely agree with all that. And I think in some ways, the agenda, we can sort of see the contours there. You can see it in the Green New Deal and sort of, the centering of public investment, not sort of to sort of boost profit making, but actually to center sort of life making. So whether that's a care economy, whether that's, as Laurie mentioned, sort of cities which are sort of full of thriving life because you've reclaimed, what is currently private space for sort of shared spaces. It's the building out of and the decommodifications of the removing from markets, sort of the things that we all need to live well and thrive on, because not only is that good for extending freedom, extending sort of the ability for all of us to thrive, giving everyone the resources and capabilities, it's also much lower in terms of its environmental impacts if we sort of pool and scale and democratically steward resources rather than sort of the current consumption model, the current sort of production model that Laurie alludes to. And so, in the book, we sort of sketch a whole variety of things, and it sort of, goes from everything from the food system through to what does a 21st century commons look like if we sort of stewarded collective resources rather than sort of privatized, enclosed and extracted them, whether that's data, whether that's the Amazon rainforest. But then we also look at sort of some of the sort of the core institutions that sort of drive extraction and environmental breakdown. So, for example, one of the ones that, when we talk about the market delivering clean energy, delivering, all the things that we need in this transition, what we say is it's really important to recognize, and there's a movement in the US, sort of the law and political economy movement, which is kind of at the forefront of this. What we really need to recognize is that there's no sort of apolitical market. There's no market that will deliver us transition that stands outside of politics. It's actually politics, our institutions, the power that shapes the sort of how those institutions then shape the markets, and how we allocate resources through law, through welfare systems, through regulation. That shapes how markets operate. So we've actually got extraordinary democratic power if we choose to use it. And of course, neoliberalism has been about sort of excluding democratic control from markets. But we've got extraordinary power to remake markets. So whether that's rethinking the sort of the corporation, so as a legal institution, it's sort of centered on meeting environmental and social needs rather than maximizing sort of the wealth of investors. Whether that's about sort of intellectual property rights around sort of who has access to certain goods or not, and the vaccine IP sort of apartheid that we're seeing essentially globally is a good example of why we need to reform that, right down to sort of new forms of green industrial strategy. So yes, we need strategies for how we're going to decarbonize and expand green public transport, let's say. But we also really need to, in a context of this long downturn of long stagnation of the last few decades, think about centering things like a care economy, caring work, valuing both wage and unwaged care work as at the center of what a post-carbon economy would look like. And that will require conscious action. We simply can't expect, or will not happen if we just leave that to the market.
Where in the world should we be looking right now as a model? Where has this transcended politics, or is politics really, where have the leaders actually caught up to these ideas? Which
I think a first thing to say is that if you develop a measure, this has been done, if you develop a measure of what countries offer to their population, standard of living, your political voice, all the things that we say would make up a good life, and you plot that next to their impact on the environment, kind of in our minds, it may be that, the more a country offers, the more developed that country may be, and then maybe its impacts on the environment won't be as much, right? China's trashing its rivers, whereas here in the UK or the US, we've got clean rivers now. That actually isn't the case. It roughly is a linear relationship in that the more you're offering to a population, the more you're destroying the environment. And in that respect, no country can rightly be described as a developed nation. This is work done by Kate Rayworth, an academic here in the UK, along with some people at a university here. And so no country is a developed nation. We're all in many respects developing because we're yet to provide a kind of a standard of living that we would deem as universally desirable while not destroying the environment. So the first thing to say is that no one is really doing this properly, but constituent elements of it exist out there. And before you come in, Matt, and give some of those, I'm sure, on things like ownership and other things like that, we are beginning to see countries that are playing around, for example, with different ideas of what the purpose of the economy is, what the objective should be for government policy beyond this focus on maximizing GDP and continual material growth, right? There's a lot of excitement.
Which countries are they?
So we've got New Zealand. We've got New Zealand who passed recently a welfare budget, which sought to allocate government money not just to maximize economic growth, but instead to help with well-being, with mental health, things like this. That's being experimented with some other countries as well. They're adopting this, what's called a well-being approach. Scotland is looking into actually a part of the UK. Some of the Nordic countries are looking at that as well. And that could be this is really important because that really begins to shift the logic within government and within policy away from this unremitting focus and narrative around that consumption model. It's not a silver bullet, but it's the beginning of something. And then, Matt, yeah, there are other countries around the world, right, that are experimenting with different ways to run their economic system that help.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess two examples on different scales. So I think one example was Lula and Dilma in Brazil's management of the rainforest, the Amazon rainforest, where they did a whole series of things around, really strengthening indigenous communities that live in the rainforest, their rights to steward and nurture and protect the forests, sort of stopped, limited the right of loggers, miners, ranchers to burn and exploit the rainforest. And actually you really saw for the first time ever really this new model of stewardship of a common resource. The rainforest didn't just stop deforesting, it actually sort of began reforesting. And Brazil really is the front line in many ways and sort of emblematizes a lot of these trends, because in Bolsonaro, you have obviously someone who embodies the far right, pro fossil fuel, violence towards indigenous communities, very racialized view of the world in his approach. And we see that with the burning of the Amazon and the rapid re-acceleration of deforestation. So I think that model, and I think therefore Lula's potential sort of presidential campaign is one to watch, but also a model of how to manage natural systems in a way that can bring them back into line with sort of healthy wider ecologies. And then on a more sort of granular level, I think, and someone like Mike Davis in the US has written about this in some of his work, but the city as this sort of both intensely environmentally unstable in some ways in terms of consumption levels, etc., but at the same time could really be the incubator of sort of post-carbon luxury, whether that's green public transport systems, whether that's shared amenities that we've been talking about, whether that's sort of the provision of public goods as sort of right as sort of a resident, so free broadband access, sort of rental controls on sort of decarbonized housing stock. The city as an experiment for the future and an incubator of the future, and this is the vanguard of the post-carbon movement. And you can see that in places like Barcelona, where they're sort of remaking the city to kind of reclaim it from sort of the private control of the motor vehicle. You can see it in London, where they're sort of really expanding out sort of the zones where you can sort of or limiting where you can drive, but also expanding out sort of environmental controls around air pollution, etc., etc. You can see it in a whole host of cities. And I think so those combinations of these real front lines of the sort of environmental and climate struggle, and where they can join with economic and environmental justice, and places like Brazil as an example. But then also I think cities would be a real sort of one to watch in terms of that experimentation.
Oh my God, I have so many more questions. Well, and the state cities are run by Democrats, so there's actually a more feasible path to victory, even in progressive cities like New York, if you can take on big industries like real estate and the police. I mean, those are the two that are really preventing everything, and they have a stranglehold on our city's lawmakers, even the progressive ones. So I'm sure it's very similar with other, London in particular, I think, has some of the same obstacles that New York faces, but hopefully sooner rather than later. Laurie Laybourn, and Matthew Lawrence, thank you so much for joining us. So many more questions. Hope to have you back on. We can talk more. Unfortunately, we're an hour show, but go check out their new book, Planet on Fire, a Manifesto for the Age of Environmental Breakdown. You can go check it out at Verso Books. Verso Books, a partner for our book club, as well as Haymarket. So go check it out at versobooks.com. Thank you, too.
Thanks a lot.
Appreciate your work.
Bye.
All right, we will be right back with Simon and Piper for today's news and our panel. Lots of news today. Oh, boy. Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. All right, we have our Tuesday panel. Simon Narode is a socialist writer, and he is a producer here at the Nomiki Show. And Piper Winkler is the co-chair, founder of Harvard DSA, DSA? I think it's DSA, as well as a producer over here as well at the Nomiki Show. So another mass shooting. I don't think people really understand how often. I mean, yes, we see them in the news when they're, outside of the normal. I'm saying this from a perspective of outside of the normal news events of mass shootings, because mass shootings do happen regularly. We've had 7 in the last week. And I'm not talking about mass shootings where it's over 2 people. I'm talking about, in some instances, 3, 4, 5, 6 people. This one last night, of course, was in Boulder at a grocery store. And we are on a hamster wheel in this country. Hamster wheel debate over many issues that just doesn't make sense to most Americans, majority of Americans, even gun owners who want, sensible gun laws, climate change, of course. We are having the same conversations over and over. And then you hear Tom Cotton, Senator Tom Cotton. He, at a hearing on gun violence, this is who he had to blame. Let's play that clip.
There has been extended, systematic attacks on our police and law enforcement professionals for years, calling them racist and bigoted and prejudiced, demanding that they be defunded and replaced with social workers. when you condemn the police, when you make it harder to do their job, you shouldn't be surprised that criminals take advantage of the opportunities that follow, and that crime rises, and that in particular, violent crime rises. Likewise, some on the left like to complain about mass incarceration. There has been...
This guy, man, this guy, wow. First off, he got part of defund the police, right? Finally, someone said, and replace them with social workers. Social workers are going to cause so much crime, storming homes and not murdering women sitting in their bed who... Piper.
Yeah, it should come as no surprise that this is such an off-base answer, but I'm listening to this and, realizing that, of course, Tom Cotton is leaving a huge part out of the picture. Just a few days, I think it was 5 days before this mass shooting, the NRA successfully shot down a ban on assault weapons in Boulder, celebrated this, and then while details about the mass shooting were coming out, the NRA was tweeting the text of the Second Amendment. So there's this sense that obviously the right has coalesced around that what's going to solve everything is arming police officers, when we know the brutality, the racism that informs the way that police officers then use those weapons and cause people to feel unsafe in their own communities. This is a totally unsatisfactory answer from Tom Cotton that really misses the point that obviously the failure of, well, I guess more importantly, even the power of the NRA, the power of the gun lobby, and the failure to recognize and acknowledge the fact that these kinds of weapons have no place in our community. That's really what I think is more important to focus on when talking about the story of what's unfolded here.
There's this debate that often comes up on conservative media, or even actually CNN as well, where I used to find myself debating, the good guy with a gun situation, right? And the FBI itself has released statistics saying, it is more viable for you to throw an object like a chair or whatever that's, in front of glasses at a shooter than it is for you to pull out a gun, because even law enforcement scored incredibly low in times of stress hitting a target, because there's a million things going. Your brain is stressed out. You might. So they advise against it, even with law enforcement, which is incredible to me. The fact that these talking points can exist in the law enforcement community and then get lost because the NRA, who is now going bankrupt, thank goodness, has this power. I mean, what they do is they go and they lobby Tom Cotton. They lobby Ted Cruz. Simon, before we get to you, can I just play the Ted Cruz clip, because it's similar. So let's play Ted Cruz at this hearing.
And every time there's a shooting, we play this ridiculous theater where this committee gets together and proposes a bunch of laws that would do nothing to stop these murders. Senator from Connecticut just said the folks on the other side of the aisle have no solutions. Well, the senator from Connecticut knows that is false. And he knows that's false because Senator Grassley and I together introduced legislation, Grassley-Cruz, targeted at violent criminals, targeted at felons, targeted at fugitives, targeted at those with serious mental disease, to stop them from getting firearms, to put them in prison when they try to illegally buy guns. What happens in this committee after every mass shooting is Democrats propose taking away guns from law-abiding citizens, because that's their political objective. But what they propose, not only does it not reduce crime, it makes it worse.
I mean, Simon, this is like some level of spin. I mean, we've seen a lot of spin come from them before, and none of these guys who stormed these in the last week, at least, the massage parlor slaughter, or the one at the grocery store, they bought their guns legally, and they did not have a criminal record. So which criminals are they talking about?
Right, exactly. And it's so typical to see these conservatives, clutch their pearls when it comes to like conversations around gun control, and yet they'll also so quickly defend these terribly violent institutions like police and prisons, as Tom Cotton did, like in the same breath, right? And I'm so glad that Piper talked about the violence that police do when they have access to these guns. And I guess in along those lines, it's worth noting that not all leftists are in favor of gun control legislation that so frequently ignores the main purveyors of gun violence, which are the military and the police, particularly the United States military and police. And, you know, there's a conversation to be had about, like, you know, does, you know, why are politicians so quick to get, to put control around citizens buying guns where, you know, they're not going to do anything at all when there's like a shooting from police. They won't do anything to get guns out of the hands of police officers. Or to defund or demilitarize police departments.
They want to get guns out of the hands of people of color. Let's be very clear. There have been Michael Bloomberg, this big advocate for gun reform, you know, had a buyback program in New York, specifically in communities of color. You know, they're fine with some people having the guns, white people, white guys, police, people who, you know, whether it's in the prison system, they've no problem with that. They have a lot of problem with people legally buying guns. And even when they do legally, they get pulled over and get killed, as we know with Fernando Castile or so many others who've experienced this. That's the hearing I want to see. The hearing, you know, you want to talk about gun legislation in a reasonable way, and we want to talk about criminals. Great, let's talk about this. Let's have a reasonable conversation about the racism that exists, has been reported on, is being investigated in police forces across this country, and we're arming these people, simultaneously going after unarmed Black men and women and people of color or undocumented people. I mean, the list could go on, who may have legal guns, may not even be armed. Doesn't matter. Your idea of a criminal is not what is actually criminal. I'm so sick of this debate. I'm sorry, guys. It's just like, you know.
It's really frustrating. Yeah, and I same as you. I want to have a hearing where we actually talk about all of the violence that occurs in this country, especially along the lines of race and gender and class, and how a lot of that violence, some of it's done with guns, and most of the time, it's done at the hands of the state. And so, you know, we got to really look at the sources of violence and make sure that our legislation and the conversations that we're having around it are addressing that.
Not to mention the data, you know, the NRA 15, 20 years ago lobbied to remove the efforts to collect accurate data. You know, most of the non-state level gun violence is from suicides, which is a mental health crisis, which of course Medicare for All would be a great solution for, right? You know, there's so many, and after the pandemic, I imagine it's going to be worse, or it has been worse. But they're also not measuring the violence that police have inflicted, how many shootings that police have inflicted on people in this country. All right, so related, we have a crisis at the border. I use the word crisis because it is a crisis, because for the last 20 years, we have manned up, militarized the border. We have, in the last administration, had a zero tolerance policy where we basically, it became even more of a humanitarian crisis due to other crises in Central America, foreign policy in Central America. So we all know what's happening at the border. Biggest surge of folks being detained in the last 20 years. This was a huge deal back when, like, Pat Buchanan was talking about building a border wall in the Clinton years, going into the George W. Bush years. So here we are. Let's show some photos of what's the current state. These are from CBS News. These are the detention centers. We've seen photos like this before during the Trump years. In the last couple of years, the Biden administration is reluctant to call this a crisis. They probably appropriately blame Donald Trump for exacerbating the situation. On day one, you know, I'll give credit where credit is due. President Biden did acknowledge that, you know, they were going to allow unaccompanied minors cross the border. They acknowledged that they were going to have to improve the facilities and amp up, you know, funding. They proposed an immigration bill, which is, you know, pretty decent, I'd say, to Congress. But it's not happening fast enough. And Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, acknowledged this crisis as if they didn't know it existed before they entered office. Piper, I'll start with you. I mean, what could defund ICE? Yes, but this is so broken that the crisis can't keep up with any sort of even immediate changes. Like what could be done?
Yeah, I mean, I have obviously, I think one of the big hallmarks of Biden's presidency so far has been him making these intermittent statements like, we need to act on this. This is what he said in the wake of the Boulder shootings. And I completely agree that, creating a safer community for people, while of course not fully funding the police rather than defunding them, that's not the move that should be made. But we need to act being said about things like, raising the minimum wage, and then that not happening. Biden isn't saying we need to act here. And it's extremely concerning. I think nothing can really express my rage, for example, at hearing people say that the Biden administration is housing people in these facilities, which are clearly not meant for human habitation. And the fact that the Biden administration is now overseeing the greatest number of human beings detained in these centers is obviously something that any president with any kind of moral foundation would immediately say, we need to act about this. But Biden's not going to say that because, for his presidency so far, and really for his time in power, he has constantly been backing up those kinds of programs of deportation and creating situations where human beings are considered illegal.
I mean, he literally said, stay home. So, I'm sorry, why do you think people they're risking their lives, they're leaving their countries, Guatemala, Honduras, we know, Nicaragua, we know the humanitarian crisis happening. Then Mexico put a stop. I mean, every step of the way, they're putting their lives at risk. And it cost them thousands of dollars with coyotes to go across we know these stories. You think that if people had a choice to stay home, they wouldn't? I don't understand how he could, in 2021, as an effing Democratic president, say that. Stay home. Simon, sorry. It's a day where I'm losing my mind.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way that you do. It's enraging. I mean, it's just like, you can't look at those pictures and feel like they're not being treated like people, right? Like you don't acknowledge someone's humanity and then put them in those conditions. It's heartbreaking, and it's really frustrating to see politicians act like this isn't a crisis when they were calling it a crisis during their campaign, right? Like, I mean, Kamala Harris went to some of these detention facilities and was like, this is awful. We need to do something about this, and was able to use that to get political points or something. And then, now it's running the country with Joe Biden and reopening those same facilities that she was standing outside of. It is a tremendous crisis, and I would love to see it stop happening around these conversations of like very partisan conversations of like, the Republicans are doing this to people, and then the Republicans being like, oh, look at the Democrats, what they're doing to people, they're hypocrites, rather than just like, hey, can we just like start treating people like humans and acknowledge a crisis when we see it?
I mean, even Henry Cuellar is sending pictures, and he's, he was the only Democrat to vote against the PRO Act. So let's just put that in perspective in the House. It's incredibly frustrating when even Bush administration officials are saying things like, well, the solution would be to find proper housing, but we don't have the money for that. Everybody rolls their
buy that? Does anybody buy that?
That's what I said.
Plenty of money for military weapons, plenty of money for things that don't influence the well-being of people here.
Someone should start a business to house, I'm sure this exists, to help with the logistics and housing of folks who've been detained or who need to be reunited with their family members here, or bringing them in from elsewhere. Someone should have come up with a for-profit model to that. And if only Dolly Parton could invest in that, since she invested in the Moderna vaccine. I don't know if you guys know that. Yeah, Dolly Parton reference. Or Elon Musk, maybe you build an effing spaceship to house, beautiful spaceship to house, oh my God, I don't even know.
Wait for the capitalists to save us.
I don't know how capitalists work.
There's a profit motive involved. Nothing good is ever gonna come of it.
Of course, I know. I'm just coming up with the short-term analysis. All right, let's before we wrap, I want to talk about the filibuster because it's on the table right now. People are being lobbied essentially because everything's being held up by the filibuster or Joe Biden not doing anything. So let's Mitch McConnell has some thoughts on the filibuster. Shocker. Let's roll that clip. Oop, I think we had to unmute. Oh, fun. Let's give it one more try. Is it working, Dorsey? Okay, we'll give him a second. Anyways, I got my vaccine today, guys.
Congratulations.
Maybe that's why I'm rage-filled. I was like losing my mind. All right, let's play the clip.
About a year ago, former President Obama launched a new, coordinated, and very obvious campaign to get liberals repeating the claim that the Senate rules are somehow a relic of racism and bigotry.
It's a campaign, guys. It's not in history at all. Piper.
Amazing. Yeah, I mean, there's truly so many different examples to pull out and point to here, including the fact that in hearings in Congress that we've even listened to, during this very episode, the fact that white supremacist and misogynistic murders that have just taken place in the past week, are not ample concern to enact gun reform and to enact other policies that will keep people safe and to fight for racial justice. I mean, there's really, really so much to point to here, but episode 4000 of Mitch McConnell is not your friend.
In the latest episode of Mitch McConnell is ruining our country. Simon.
Yeah. I don't know. What else do you say about it, right? I feel if you're in the Senate, and especially if you've been in the Senate for as long as you have to know something about the history of the country and the history of the Senate and the history of the United States government and its legacy of white supremacy and how that has infiltrated every single facet of our government.
He's listened to Democrats speak. He's listened to progressives speak. I mean, this is the amazing thing is they pretend like they don't. There are definitely Republicans who live in little bubbles, information bubbles, most of America, that's Republican. But they're very aware of what the opposition's saying and the reason, and they're presented the facts and they're lobbied. So there you go.
Yeah.
All right, Simon, go ahead, Simon, go ahead.
I was just going to say, the filibuster's got to go, but I think it's going to be a bit of a challenge. I mean, I remember even Bernie Sanders was talking about not wanting to abolish the filibuster during his primary campaign, which always confused me a little bit. But then there's a separate question of after we abolish the filibuster, it's more than the filibuster is not the only problem with us getting through the legislation we want. Like we've seen just recently with the $15 minimum wage, like when we can pass it through budget reconciliation, we still can't. So we just can't get enough Democrats on board. So we've got more hurdles to climb, but the filibuster is the first.
We need to challenge Manchin and Sinema and whoever is going to be next in line, because you know that another one's going to flip. There's always one. It's like a game of whack-a-mole. That's what it is. All right, Piper Winkler, Simon Rode, thank you for joining us this Tuesday. Looking forward to seeing you next time. And I'm going to do some shout outs with everybody else. We have Sam Talarico. Anna Rage and Nomiki Rage are my favorite Rage. Thank you. I'm Greek. She's Armenian and I'm Greek. It's like part of our DNA. Mr. Quimper subscribed at Tier 1 on Twitch and is currently on a 3-month subscription streak. Thank you so much, Mr. Quimper. Before the cause, sending some love, having recently flown in from MR, as I often do, and zowie, are my arms tired? I appreciate the pre-show feed. Majority report, that's very funny. Biped Snake says, I'm waiting the delivery of my first order from Sunset Lake. I have it next to me because I don't know if this is from my vaccine because it's not supposed to hit you the first dose, but feeling like a little, I felt a little off immediately. They said sometimes you can have a reaction, like a slight reaction. My arm doesn't hurt yet, knock on wood. So I put some CBD into my water here, and maybe it's helped me out. So go check out Sunset Lake CBD. All right, who else do we have here? And Kosin sends some love. Nomiki. So Alfred McCoy has a new book coming out in October, To Govern the Globe, World Orders and Catastrophic Change. You should definitely have him on to talk about it and his previous book. Thank you for the suggestion. I'll put that down. Let me write that down right now so I don't forget. Alfred McCoy. J. Manuel sends love. Thank you, J. Manuel. And Northern Lights also sends some love. And Torches and Pitchforks sends love. And Stimmy, yeah, Stimmy, yay, Stimmy, yay. Give me the check so I can give it away. I feel like I'm not saying that right, Torches and Pitchforks. Stimmy, yeah, Stimmy, yeah. Wait, Stimmy, yeah, Stimmy, yeah, Stimmy, yay. Give me the check so I can give it away. Did I get that right? Is that a Dorsey says nice. Kyla Rosado says, do you think a fiction book about charting the course of climate change via nonlinear vignette style would be good and influential in shifting the profit motive culture for those fossil fuel execs, like for the nonlinear vignette style on the climate fiction, moving between the present and the impeding apocalypse, constantly switching over and over? Thoughtful. I think I don't know. I mean, the question I didn't have I didn't ask what they touched on is just everything is so, in those North countries that are shifting their economic models, and New Zealand, who has a socialist head of state, they're not tethered to this short-term, Wall Street, like markets driven. Everything is market driven here. And I think that just eats away at every single institution, every single aspect of our economy, not to mention also campaign finance. Same thing. It's so short term. And I think, that's one thing that we have to start having bigger conversations about is how do we chip away at the short-term profit-driven model in our country and in Japan, in the EU. I mean, tethering it to the stock market which is of course not indicative of any sort of real economic change happening. Kowalski from Nebraska says, it is flooding here again. Climate change can't be stopped till we have lab-grown meat to free up the land for this large-scale carbon sequester programs. We have tech to do this. Now we will just lack the will. Yes, we just lack the will all around. A difficult truth. Is Nomiki going to say poggers? Poggers! Pogger! Pogger! All right. Is that everything? No, we don't. We have some more. Okay. Yes, those are all the shout outs on in that space. Professor Harvey K is mixing it up in the live chats on Twitch and YouTube. Thank you for joining us. We have a clip we're going to share of you tomorrow. I'm going to make sure to do that. We didn't get to it today. And big thank you to Midi Docs and Mario for working those algorithms. And of course, our YouTube moderators, Bob C, Choke in the Orb, and Chuck Diesel, keeping the space troll free. And over on Twitch, Dorian Sapiens, A Difficult Truth, Nightbot, Dorsey's favorite, not that we have favorites, and Our Means, a Nug Wrangler. Thank you guys so much. We will see you tomorrow. Stay in solidarity.